everybody? I'm glad you can hear me. I have to use this thing today because I'm very much projecting, so you'll have to bear with me. Glad that so many of you can make it out today. Getting ready for the sermon this morning, I made a short version and a long version in case we had another bird in here, like we did Wednesday night Bible class. You know, in case we had to set aside 10 minutes to get it out, but since it looks like it's just humans in here this morning, it looks like you guys get stuck with the long version. Sorry about that. All right, so while I found out that I was only going to be preaching this, it came up to me a couple weeks ago. The idea actually kind of goes back a little further than that. I was having a conversation at work. A bunch of us were in the conference room in the afternoon about hell, since Lent was coming up, and the Catholics were trying to explain how they were avoiding it by not eating meat on Fridays, which still, I don't know, someone's going to have to explain that one to me. I still don't quite get their reasoning on that. But then it moved on from there to talking about Jewish hell and Protestant hell, and no one really seemed fully convinced that there was any one truth, but they were convinced still that they were going to get to or avoid their heaven and hell of their religion. And that really kind of bothered me at the end of the day. Like, I get that there's been a lot of different people now believing different things about what's going to send you there, but you still think that they would all kind of be able to understand the same concept of what heaven and hell would be like, but apparently that's no longer true. This then led me to realize that one of the bigger factors in this is, at least from what I was thinking, was political correctness, that it's getting incorrect to thought anything is true that someone else might find objectionable. And then this in turn drives the TV and the media programming we see every day that use these wishy-washy ideas and then put them out there, and people see them and accept them, and it continues. A recent big example of this is called The Good Place. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It's from NBC. Debuted a couple years ago at the end of 2016 to over 8 million people, to a big hit smash reviews. It's been renewed for a third season already, so you can tell people out there really like it, which is kind of really disappointing because there's a lot of inaccuracies in there about the afterlife, and that's kind of where I'm coming from for my sermon this morning, kind of using it as a base point outline for us to take and discuss from. So as you can see there, my title is kind of stolen from them, called The Good Place. Now, a lot of you guys who have heard some of my sermons know that I kind of follow an outline, and it's always pretty standard, around 9 points or so, and just vary it based on what the topic's going to be. And today I'm going to continue that, but we're going to be doing it as an acrostic out of the title, The Good Place, with each of the major points for those of you who are wanting to take notes, starting with the first letter in the words. The first one of these is the G, for God the Judge. Now, Revelation 20:11 through 15 shows us the scene of God sitting on his throne distributing justice to those of the earth out of the book of life. But every year it seems like that this picture is becoming less and less acceptable or even believable to people of the world. They say that here that we shouldn't judge them as we don't know all about them. And to be honest, that is a fair point. We are not omniscient. We can't know what's going on in their hearts. But where the problem tends to arise is where since none of us can, that there can't be anyone who is omniscient and so deny that there could be a God and that he has created an absolute moral right. Instead, they prefer, if they bother to acknowledge an afterlife at all, it's something much more like the first episode of the show, where they kind of wake up in a nice little tidy office and there's a man in a suit sitting across a desk from them saying, "Congratulations, you were good enough." Then they kind of use this and imply that this is actually one of a bunch of rooms, and they kind of ignore whoever is above the guy sitting there and duck the question of, is there a God? Or what is the God in charge of heaven and hell? And similarly, another show from a few years back called Drop Dead Diva, there was another girl hit in a traffic accident that awoke to be reviewed by a case agent, and he was talking with her about her life's needs. And it's hopeful that while not everyone is convinced that there will be no judgment, enough people out there still believe in the judgment that these TV shows are still getting viewers. So there's still some hope in reaching to them, even if the view doesn't exactly match what was in our text this morning from Matthew 25, where it again showed him sitting at his throne, sorting people to the left and to the right. Their real point in the world where they're falling short on this is that they're not giving credit to God as the judge. Our next point this morning, this brings us on to the first O. I stole this title from one of Mom's old soap operas that she used to love, called One Life to Live. Yeah, I take it from the Chuckles. A few other people used to watch that one too. Very good. This concept is pretty well described by its name, that we only have one time here on earth in which we're being judged. There's no second or third chances. Life isn't a Nintendo game where you get your 3 tries to get Mario all the way to the end and save the princess, or you get to turn it off and back on again anytime you feel like it to ignore the consequences of a bad decision. This idea is becoming weaker and weaker, though, as those who know they aren't doing what's right now tell themselves it'll be okay. They can have another chance. Going back to the show I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the Drop In Diva, the premise of the show is that the woman woke up in the afterlife and then manages to make an escape back to Earth and take another body and live and be judged on her deeds and get the second chance. And while it's a nice story of redemption, we know that that's not really practical. Similar, in the show The Good Place, the main character, Eleanor, comes to believe that she got into heaven by mistake when she died at the same time as someone else who shared the same name as her, who did better on earth than she did. And so she tries to learn about morality and to better herself so that she can earn her place once she's there, after she was dead. And now other systems of beliefs that humanity has devised throughout history also try to lend credence to the concept of more than one life, also commonly known as reincarnation. Many believe that the deeds you do in this life determine whether you become something or someone greater or lesser in the next. And then this pattern is repeated on and on and on until one manages to become fully enlightened, or I guess to the heat death of the universe. They don't really say there. And without bringing the Bible into it, I always had a big problem with that, is that say you get made into a cow into your next life, then how can you go on from there? What makes a cow a bad cow? Did you not give the humans enough milk? Did you eat the wrong grass? Did you kick somebody? Like, what exactly defines a good cow? And then even if you are a good cow, where do you go? Do you get to become a horse? Do you go to being a human? You know, what's the order? Like, no one really seems to fully understand that, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. What does make a lot of sense is that there is just one chance for everyone, one time, no ifs, ands, or exceptions. That's what we can understand, and that makes sense. And this is also what the Bible says. Psalms 39, 4 and 5, David tells, as his life is fleeting, that all lifetimes are short before God, and that all of mankind is in a similar condition. And it's not just him, or most people, or everyone but me, it's everyone. And similarly, James discusses in chapter 4, verses 14, where he speaks that life is like a mist that vanishes shortly, not that dims and comes back again later, but just there and vanishes. And finally, also Solomon, in Ecclesiastes at the end of the book, he speaks of needing to live life that at the end of the one life you have here, God will bring your deeds into judgment. And now, having established that God is the judge, and we have one life to live in which we are judged, this brings us to the third point, background to the argument of needing omniscient judgment. One of the big problems, as I mentioned earlier, is that there's no one here that can see and understand everything that's going on in someone's heart, their history, their motivations, or even everything they do. So they rationalize there can't be anyone like that. And we know from the text we just read in Ecclesiastes, where it says that God judges them based on the secret deeds and all the deeds we do, whether good or bad. And then we know from there we go. Going over to Matthew 13, 47 through 50, shows that God sorting his people out from the good, from the bad. And we've understood this concept comes from understanding the fruits that you bear in life. The fruits, generally listed that Paul has put in Galatians 5:18-25 is their most commonplace. And one further key point to understand here is that the fruits you produce are what matters. You can't be accepted into heaven as a tree bearing good fruit simply by being descended from a line of good trees. The fact that one's parents are hardworking, dedicated Christians alone doesn't mean that the child can ignore God and be saved. And similarly, this rules out the concept of infant baptism, as the parents are the ones doing it for the child, not the child actually producing the fruit from their faith and belief. No more than me buying a year-old apple tree and planting it in the backyard and gluing some apples to the branches are going to give it and say that that tree is growing those apples. It just doesn't make sense. And there are no accidents in God's judgments or equivocations. When we look at apples, for example, some we hold one up might be good. Others kind of might look at it if they know more about apples and judge that it's gone bad. But it's not the case with God. He's able to look into it without opening it and to tell if the apple is good and bad. Thus, there are no happy coincidences or accidents or loopholes of who's going to be in heaven. There's no potential like in the show where, if you die just the right time or in the right place, or having done one or two right things, that you'll be let in. And so then, this discussion of the fruits leads us on to our next point. Deeds are not enough. Most concepts in human morality contain the tenet that one must do the right thing in whatever time or place you're in, or more recently, with the advent of situational ethics, you have to do whatever's the most right thing in the situation. And this goes back again to the show. There's a very easy example. See, there was a very good point system that they were told about after they died, that they had earned enough points to earn their way into the good place, that you donate time at a soup kitchen is worth 50 points, or holding open the door for someone behind you was worth another 2 points. And this does kind of seem to fit the standard at first glance, because we know that we can't be saved by faith alone. For as James discusses, we show our faith by our works. Or going back again this morning to our text, verses 34 to 36, we are told that they were saved based on the care for others that they expended on Jesus' behalf. And then again, in Matthew 7 there, where Jesus reaches the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he discusses the trees based upon the fruit that they bear. And then there's the other verses I was talking about there. And while this sounds like a nice theory, from what we've examined so far this morning, upon closer examination, some complications do rise to the surface. If all that's required to get into heaven is to do enough good deeds, then as long as you do enough, you'd be free to do whatever you want to do with the rest of your time. You could go rob a bank every weekend as long as you gave half the money to help orphans, or spend half the week drunk as long as you spend the other half in church. Where's the logic in that? It doesn't make sense. If that was the case, anyone who had enough money could just donate some of it to help others and then do whatever they wanted with the rest, and not actually have to be a good person, but having done enough good things. Another one that really helps explain why this doesn't make a lot of sense is the New Testament character of Demas. He's shown in Philemon at the end of the letter as Paul lists him among the good workers with him. And then later in the last book that's accredited to Paul chronologically of 2 Timothy, at the end of that one, he's told he's returned to the world and fallen away. If having a certain minimum number of good deeds was all that was required, wouldn't he still have been saved, as he was doing a good worker and having been with Paul for so long? But since it shows here that he is not, we must assume that there is something flawed in the premise. And Jesus seems to believe that as well. We're going back to where he was at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. He goes on to say that not all who do works in his name will be saved. So while it is clear that we are being judged based on our deeds, it's more than that. You have to have the right faith behind it, going back to James's point. And so then this finishes up good. We're moving on now into place, starting with P. Placement is final. We've already examined and rejected the idea that there's a way to return to earth and get a second chance at judgment. However, some still cling to the hope that there will be time to get into heaven after death. Going back to the TV show The Good Place, throughout the second season now, Eleanor and the other characters found out that they were actually in the bad place that was pretending to be the good place in order to elaborately, psychologically mess with them. So now they're hoping to escape and get to a judge and be allowed into the good place, and having been sentenced to hell already. Now, I definitely understand wanting to get out if you found that you were there, for there is no pleasant description of hell to be found in the Bible. In Matthew 8 and 12, Jesus describes it as the outer darkness, full of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then again in chapter 13, verses 42 and 50, where he adds the lovely addition of it being a fiery furnace. And he repeats again in 22:13, 24:51, 25:30. It's just on and on, that it is definitely not a place you want to be. And then Luke 13:28 even adds that you get to see what's going on over in heaven, and you get your nose rubbed in it, that you can't be there, and you're stuck where you're at. No one in his right mind would want to be in the place that Jesus describes. And further, if you did end up there, you definitely would want to escape if it was possible. But what would be the point of the punishment if you could escape? If you could get out of any speeding tickets you got, why wouldn't everyone just go 90 miles an hour down 696 if there was no consequences? You'd get where you're going quicker, it'd be more convenient, there'd be no negative consequences. God thought in a similar manner. So you can see the next passage, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus over in Luke 16:19 to 31. Just a second. In this story, Jesus told of two men that while they lived on the earth, one was provided with every luxury imaginable, and then there was Lazarus, who got sores, diseases, and poverty. Definitely the short end of the stick. And when both had died, the formerly rich man was subjected to punishment and agony, and he was able to look across and see Lazarus with Abraham in the land of plenty. And he strongly desired that one of them be allowed to go between the two areas to provide him with comfort. However, this travel was prevented by the great chasm that Jesus described between the two areas, and it could not be crossed. And so you can tell that it's definitely too late to be able to escape hell once you're already there, no matter what people today hope. And now the story of the rich man and Lazarus takes us to the next point. Hell, limited outcomes. The idea that there's not a multiplicity of places where you can end up after you die, but just two. There were only two areas divided by the canyon in the story, the side that Lazarus was on and the side where the rich man ended up. There weren't a plethora of canyons, there weren't multiple heavens and multiple hells where you could get sorted into based on your religion, your ethnicity, your personality, or how many good deeds you did, or some other physical trait. Similarly, there was just the one hell. Now, a lot of people in the world today are uncomfortable with the binary nature that we are presented with. They are uncomfortable with just being for or against, and they seek any way they can find to be just neutral and to stay out of it. Back at the example we've been looking at from the show, there was a good place and a bad place, but they also added one more that they called the medium place. There was a character who was pretty bad while she was on Earth for the majority of her life, but then at the end discovered an idea and put into her will a way to help thousands of starving children. And so while this was good, it wasn't enough to get her into the good place given all the bad she'd done. So she ended up at something that they decided to make especially for her called a medium place. It wasn't torture or a place of pleasure, just pretty much boring, to be honest. It was having a house that was like slightly always too warm, or having pop to drink but never any ice to put in it, or only a pretty bad movie that you see like the cable movies repeating forever, never anything good. And while the show seems to do this mainly for comedic effect, it does seem to stem from people's desire to have other options for when they're not quite good enough. Similarly, other religions have long believed in the concept of purgatory, kind of formalized around 1160 to 1180. The concept was an area after physical death where one can pay off the remainder of your sins that hadn't been absolved before you died, rather than being sent to hell. Or another example, the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that there's a second earth, that there's only 144,000 they believe get to actually be in heaven, and the rest come back to a newly created earth without the evil. And while this idea is comforting to know to those who do not know the truth, it's still wrong. We know that there's only innocent and guilty, and despite our human rationalizations to try to differentiate between them, we know that God does not. We saw in our text this morning that He divided people to the left and to the right. There's no group in the middle, no spectrum from left to right with a fuzzy line or multiple lines down the middle, but people were clearly divided into two camps. And then this brings us on to A. Admission is limited. Now, again, going back to this Jehovah's Witnesses claim of 144,000, this is not what I'm saying when I'm saying admission is limited. There's no fixed number of people. Rather, I'm saying that it's going to be much more limited than what most people here on earth are willing to really accept. A lot of people think, or at least like to believe, that only those who they claim were truly evil, such as Hitler or mass murderers and serial killers, will be in hell. And that as long as you try to do the right thing, you're not really that bad, that'll be good enough to get you somewhere better. People's sense of who's going to be in heaven and hell is becoming very skewed to anyone who knows how to look for. There we go. It's a little twitchy. Going to the show Family Feud, I imagine most of you have heard of it. They conduct surveys of 100 people every time for each one of their shows, and then they have to pick which answers were the most popular. One of them that they conducted recently was on who you would least want to see with you in heaven. And the devil there only actually made it to number 3. More people would rather not see their in-laws in heaven with them, according to at least 100 people Family Feud sampled. No, not all the families get along that great, but that kind of seemed pretty extreme. Or another one, another survey they did, the one over here on this side, they asked, what would you be most disappointed if you had to do still when you get to heaven? And while some of them were pretty funny, like no one really wants to do laundry anymore in heaven, sadly, go to church was actually one of the most popular answers that made it onto this list. I really don't think the people who were worried about still having to go to church have read enough of their Bible to be able to know that that's probably what heaven's going to be a lot like. We see over in Revelation 22, verses 3 through 5, that those who were in heaven gathered around the Lord and then praise Him. So it's not really going to be their biggest issue. And then again, also Jesus tells of the way being narrow and with the large majority not on the path to eternal life with Him over in Matthew 7, 13 through 14. And He repeats it again in Luke 13, 23 through 25. Going through our title there, we're almost reaching the end. Just 2 more major points to go. C stands for conditions and terms apply. Now, time for a little survey of our own, because we were just looking at Family Feud this morning. How many of you guys use Apple phones out there? Anybody? All right, that's a good number. And how many of you guys have actually read all the way to the bottom of the terms and conditions that they make you read? There, anybody? No? Okay, yeah, I didn't either, I'll be honest. But that led to a joke recently over there in one of the ones they put out recently that on page 46 where the guy's like, you know what, no one reads this anyway. I'm just going to start writing whenever I feel like the guy Steve is smelly and I don't like him. And it was pretty funny, but that really does make a pretty good point that whenever you're signing a legal contract and agreeing to anything, you kind of should know what all is going to be required of you in order to get the services that you're wanting them to provide. For all we know, there could be some clause at the bottom where you have to give them a kidney in 20 years, and we would just have to do it because we never actually read all the way down there. And while that one's funny, it is also true in real life and serious things too. Recently, Michelle and I were getting ready to start building a house, and at the beginning of that, they made us go through a contract with them. It's about 11 pages long. It took an hour or so. You have to read through all of their different things of what's included. I think there was even one where they say that you understand that this house does not come with furniture because the house they show you does have furniture in it. And you were like, all right, but apparently people have gotten mad and sued them because their houses didn't look exactly like that, and so now they need to legally defend themselves. And so how much more important is it going to be to fully understand what you need to do to be saved? So to look at these terms and conditions, in Romans 10:17, you have to first be able to read the contract, find out what the terms are, and then the next step is belief, that you believe that the party who wrote the contract is able to follow through with what they've promised and what they've already done. And then in reading, you find in John 3:16 that is believing. And then the next condition after belief is that it's to lead you to repentance or being sorry for and turning away from what you've done wrong, as Peter preached in Acts 2:38. And then after repenting, you need to confess that Jesus is the Lord and the Son of God, from Romans 10:9. And then returning back to Acts 2:38 to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. And the final term is continued faithful living. This is much like the due care clauses on warranties that you have for your microwave or your phone case. Just as they may no longer function as they've intended and can't be guaranteed after they've been dropped or beaten up or thrown into a pool or what have you. Similarly, when you don't follow the pattern God lays out, you needing to study and to come to church and continue to grow, the salvation that He promised you may not actually come to pass. And now, while this sounds like the end of the sermon, if you've been keeping track, we got one more letter to go. E, equality of treatment. This goes to society's misconception that there will be multiple levels in heaven and hell, back to their desire to be just good enough to avoid hell as opposed to actually needing to strive to be good. This is not a modern belief only. You can find it as far back as the 14th century Italian poet Dante. He wrote his Divine Comedy, composed of 3 books dealing with the afterlife: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Otherwise known in English as Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. In this book, he is guided throughout the realms of the afterlife, and then returned to tell it. Hell was the descent through 9 concentric layers, starting with the vestibule where those who had never heard the good news of Jesus were just roaming forever. It was not a place of torture, just endless wandering. Lower levels becoming worse as they progressed. One level, people were eaten and terrorized by a large 3-headed dog, but the worst was at the bottom level, was reserved for Satan and the worst traitors and sinners in humanity, such as Judas Iscariot. And then similarly in Paradiso, heaven was arranged into different areas, and while all knew God's presence, the residents were divided into different areas based on how they'd acted on earth. However, through all that we've read here this morning and studied, we know that there is only one punishment. We know that it is not better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, as the writer of Paradise Lost had imagined Satan to say. Rather, we know that there is no good enough to earn a decent spot. that if you aren't saved, there is no hope. On the other hand, we know that there is one reward, and it is great and mighty and very much to be desired, and all there are treated equally. So now, I'm hoping that everyone here understands and believes that God will judge us at death and what he's going to base that judgment on. And further, I hope that now we're all better equipped to be able to converse with those who believe differently and help them. And at this point, if any of you had believed differently this morning and wish to ensure your place in the good place, or need to repent and reclaim that place, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.